There's a difference between clones and iterations, and at first glance I can see why people say Trinity Fusion is a Dead Cells clone, both being roguelike platformers inspired by Metroidvanias with a fixed number of weapon slots, bosses, and objectives. And even just getting started on it, Trinity Fusion will feel like Dead Cells, just in 2.5D with an obviously female protagonist, so it will be hard not to juxtapose them against each other. Now that said, when you dive into the actual progression and story, things will thankfully get a bit different. That's because Dead Cells gives the feeling of being designed as a roguelite first, with a focus on massive variety, unlocks, and unpredictable runs, with story introduced to add structure, while Trinity Fusion gives the feeling of being designed as a Metroidvania first, with world, story, and structure, but shifted to include roguelite aspects to expand the replayability. This results in taking less time to really dig into and experience the world of Trinity Fusion, for better or worse, since it is at the forefront of the experience if you're able to consistently make progress. And you will find terminals hidden throughout the zones that give you backstory and dialogue, you will encounter a handful of monologues from key figures, and beating bosses will give you explicit story content. You also have far less to unlock as well, with it mostly being ability upgrades and character improvements, while in Dead Cells you tended to see the massive arrays of new potential items and abilities expanded. This is handy for Trinity Fusion as well, since you can consistently use weapons you prefer the patterns of and the style of, and usually get them over the course of a run. And provided you unlocked the right upgrades, you'll even be able to improve those weapons you find to keep up with your current progress on the run by saving up some of your per-run currency. So getting and sticking with what you like is far more common. Trinity Fusion also has another quirk with how it plays, in that while you are technically playing one character, they are split across multiple dimensions, and directed by their version in the Prime universe, who you will quickly discover has gotten the nickname The Hitchhiker by certain more aware NPCs. This results in each of the different dimensions you need to complete feeling somewhat unique without feeling completely alien. For example, in one dimension, the level layout will be designed around an unlockable grapple arm, while in another, special traversal will focus on zones that require piloting a drone teleporter, and some even favoring the fact that not all the versions can wall jump or double jump. This is also mirrored in the enemies, with some being biological where appropriate, others being more machine, and even some designed for more open spaces of the dimensions you can travel on the surface for, or more claustrophobic enemies in areas where you have to travel underground. Now, to actually beat the game, you have to travel through the dimensions of all three characters to reach the MacGuffins you'd expect from a multi-dimensional story based around trying to save as much as possible by merging all the dimensions back into one as the instability grows. This means beating the bosses in the given dimensions, aligning the machinery, and in turn completing that run. And for some people, that might sound a bit rough, because what if you have a favorite version of the protagonist you prefer playing, and you don't really want to mess with the others? Or even worse, you might not get along with that protagonist's weapon set. Thankfully, the game has an answer for that you'll usually be able to find in the first zone of each run: the ability to merge your characters across dimensions. So, did you already unlock the grapple arm version's abilities but not really grooving with the double jump or teleporting character? Merge them with the grapple version and use her weapon pool instead. You don't lose the original character's abilities either, but you may want to reassign the hotkeys in the in-game wheel, though it makes things a bit simpler for you. The other method is actually using what is known as the in-between, and that you basically want to start as your preferred character. But instead of progressing down their path, you instead find an unstable portal and launch yourself into a challenge zone. That has a point-to-point progression system more akin to things like Slay the Spire, with a given challenge and reward on each floor. By completing this gauntlet, you can then send your character to one of the dimensions usually reserved for the other characters. These zones are also the only place you'll run into proper platforming puzzles, so if you're wanting a pinch of Celeste in your Metroidvania, this could scratch that itch a little bit as well, though it's not quite as extreme. Though before you reach the end of the game, you will want to practice in these zones at least once or twice, both for story reasons, but also because you will need those skills later on. For me though, I found all three characters performed just fine, especially after I unlocked their base movement techs, but I can totally see a preference for one or another, especially since all of the versions also have unique combat abilities. And since I prefer melee, getting that grapple arm to pull me or the enemy in close was a game changer. Now, unlocking these abilities did require a little bit of effort, since starting out, only the double jumper and the wall jumper had special movement techs. The grapple, the drone, the teleport all required getting at least a bit into a run and fighting a boss proper, so you will need to make progress to really take advantage of it. Though you probably won't win all 3 runs first try, so this early access to progression of movement was still welcome. Now, you might be asking, why don't you just merge all 3? Well, that's the kicker. You can't. At least not in normal early progression. Though it does happen later, it's only after you've made a decent bit of progress. This means you still need to be willing to make decisions and yes, even consider which ones you prefer for which path. The other type of progression thankfully keeps some strategy about it, but not quite as mechanically bound, and that is the proper meta progression rather than the movement tech progression. And this is where the plugged-in roguelite aspects actually come into play outside of just running the zones again and again until you eventually beat them. In the runs, you will get 3 types of currency. The transitory ones you spend on the run to buy stuff from shops and to unlock chests, but you also get a blue currency and a gold currency that's used to unlock the out-of-game progression, with the blue unlocking the actual abilities and gold unlocking access to new abilities. And what you unlock comes in 2 forms. A weaponsmith that lets you unlock gear upgrades that are just immediately effective, and upgrades for your prime self that allow you to improve your character, but that take up slots in a specific bar that has a limited amount of slots. The gold currency is mostly used in the latter, because it's necessary to unlock higher tiers of abilities that include some powerful options, especially if you're struggling, as well as to unlock more slots for you to inject these improvements into. I mostly did not have trouble getting either currency, and it seemed plentiful enough, at least with how I played, that even on failed runs, I was usually able to unlock more stuff to make future runs easier, even if it didn't take too many unlocks to finish the game. Though one of them I beeline to was the revival unlock, so that may be a source of bias for me. And that is, sadly, all of the roguelite progression, which I'm guessing you can tell is why I say this feels more like a Metroidvania with roguelite injected, rather than a roguelite Metroidvania like the game most people will say it's a clone of. And honestly, I think this holds it back from what it could have been. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually really did like Trinity Fusion. It's a good game and worth taking a stab at if you want an 8 to 10 hour Metroidvania with a pinch of meta progression. And if you're looking for something that'll scratch that itch, similar to Dead Cells, without taking up nearly as much time to clear out. I just think if they had stuck with the Metroidvania aspect and allowed it to play more with the cross-dimensional stuff and even merging aspects, they could have had something compelling more in the veins of games like Time Spinner and its time travel, where cross lines actually make fun and interesting impacts on other lines. So I'm left feeling like this is a game that could have been an A+ idea with B-tier execution, instead of being relegated to being just an enjoyable B across the board, with some quirks because roguelites can boast more gameplay per dollar and tend to be easier to market than a Metroidvania. Now, you may have noticed I did mention quirks there. And that wasn't just limited to the roguelite injection, or even the fact that yes, you can take this roguelite progression into the endless mode after beating the story. But rather, these quirks are visual and gameplay, some of which are thankfully getting patched, but others I'm not so sure we'll see changes to. The main quirks that they have not patched out since release that still drag down the game to that B-level kind of implementation for me are going to be 3 things. The most minor being the fact that while there are audio snippets that tell you about the world and give you hints, it's not really convenient to dig through them, unless I just absolutely miss some menu option somewhere while running through. So if you get into a fight and you can't pay attention to the tidbit of story, you're pretty much SOL when it comes to listening to them. The more major aspects, first and foremost for me, being that while this game looks fine in most situations, when things get chaotic, it becomes a lot harder to read than the crisp pixels of much flatter competitors. That and the environments are also much easier to read on these competitors too, for similar reasons. This means that I did miss a few secrets than I think I would have seen in another art style, but your mileage may vary. The other big one was something I only ran across against certain enemies, and that is iframes, invincibility frames. The dodge roll iframes were actually fine. This is more to do with the hit recovery iframes, which frankly felt almost non-existent if they're even there, with a number of multi-attack enemies straight up juggling me and taking out half or even 2/3 of my life by spamming attacks on me, especially on later stages where enemies do significantly more damage. This can also get annoying in some of the more chaotic fights where you'll be dodging a wide array of attacks, some with issues from the 2.5D I mentioned earlier making their attacks harder to see, but others where it was just bordering on bullet hell with some overspawned groups of enemies or long-range enemies off-screen. A few even being a bit frustrating due to enemy death explosions. More than once I got tossed into a poison cloud by being juggled, even though I had successfully escaped the zone of the poison cloud a moment prior. None of this was enough to keep me from progressing, but it did make things a lot more hairy in some situations, with one mistake being over-punished by the juggling. But if you do get good at the game, you can dodge most of this just by playing on Dark Souls logic. And by the end, I was avoiding a good 95% of the attacks, but did get punished hard for those occasional nat 1s. Now, all of this should tell you by now if you actually want to play the game strictly for gameplay. And really, if you enjoyed Dead Cells, you'll get a kick out of this as long as you weren't a heavy turret player, since we do actually lack a parallel of those particularly in this game. But being what it is, this game also has a story that could appeal to a different group, and it leans into it a bit more than Dead Cells. So how does that hold up for people looking for a Metroidvania? I'd say it does fine for that genre, though some people have rightfully complained that this is a little flat at times. But for me personally, that comes with most Metroidvanias unless they are built with a concerted effort of story and character integration. Trinity Fusion instead takes the Diablo approach. Build an interesting world, introduce your arc through it, and leave hints that people can build their own creativity around. That said, this will usually result in a bit of flatness, especially when your characters aren't quite as robust as they are in other games that try to pull this trick. Since we have a cliché romantic partner, a cliché bad guy, cliché interloper, etc. What the game does lack are characters like Farnham. It lacks a claptrap. It lacks characters that evoke emotion through the experience with them, that stand out and are memorable. And all of this is sadly not helped by the cinematic camera, since while the characters are indeed voice acted, their faces are not animated. The developers would have been better off having us stay in the distant 2.5D and had the characters voice act across from each other from there, since this wouldn't have been as apparent. But instead we zoom in on them, gesticulating and acting towards each other with, well, dead faces, or in the case of the hitchhiker specifically, a frankly disturbing glare. This could actually have been part of the reason I found it hard to connect with the characters as well, since it further amplified the flatness of their stories, in spite of the voice performances being fairly well rendered. So overall, like I said, it just gets a B across the board. It's better than average, but not exceptional enough to be Game of the Year. The weapons and movement are fun, the game itself is fun, but it has a few blemishes, and does end up feeling like a Metroidvania that got a roguelite shoved in on top of it, rather than a game built with this vision from the onset.